morning, everyone. Good morning. This is Bill Miles, and welcome to the Chamber's Tele-Town Hall. Thank you for joining us again today, those who are dialing in, as well as those who are joining us on Facebook Live. On this Veterans Day, it's important, I think, for everyone to remember who actually has secured the freedoms we all enjoy. And a while back, I was listening to a great message regarding Veterans Day and how important and the meaning, and wanted to share with you some of the things that I gathered out of that. You know, it's our veterans, not the reporters, who give us freedom of the press. And it's our veterans, not the poets, who give us freedom of speech. It's our veterans, not political organizers, who give us the freedom to assemble. And it's our veterans, not lawyers, who give us the freedom to have a fair trial. It's our veterans, not politicians, who give us the freedom to vote. And it's our veterans, not preachers, who give us the freedom to worship publicly. So today we pause to honor, reflect, and thank our veterans and all those serving on active duty. We don't know them all, but we certainly owe them all. And on behalf of a very grateful Chamber of Commerce, we say thank you. This morning, we're anxious to hear from some of the thought leaders looking at everything from healthcare and tourism to our economic outlook. And as we get started, I'll remind you that simply questions that you have this morning, again, to post those in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answering each of those with time permitting. And we're going to kick things off this morning, as we often do, with a big picture perspective. You know, when it comes to marketing, everything we do in the Low Country is based on research. So today, we're pleased to have with us someone who has spent the last 2 decades studying consumer and translating their always changing behaviors and opinions into marketing insights for their 170 clients. Erin Francis Cummings is the president and CEO of Destination Analyst, which is a company that designs consumer research for some of the world's greatest brands, including Bermuda, the Fiji Islands, California, and Florida, just to name a few. She's a speaker who is in high demand, and we're pleased to have her joining us this morning from San Francisco to offer fresh insight and research on what's happening in travel and how it impacts our Low Country economy. And Erin, thank you for waking up just a little bit early this morning and joining us for this call. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Erin Francis Cummings.
Oh, absolutely, Bill. It's never too early for you folks there in South Carolina. And I will say, at least North Carolina had me on at 5 a.m. my time. So at least you gave me another hour than they did. I also want to thank you, Bill, so much for those words that you said about our veterans. I come from a father and a grandfather who are vets, so that was very touching. It's a pleasure to be with you all to present on what current perceptions reveal about travel's recovery and the future of travel based on the latest findings from our Coronavirus Travel Sentiment Index study. Our company is a marketing and economics research firm. We serve the travel and hospitality industry to help them with insights into their audiences, brand, and marketing performance. And the Coronavirus Travel Sentiment Index study is research that we've independently produced consistently since March 15th to help the travel industry navigate and recover from the COVID-19 crisis. Each week, we survey 1,200 Americans who traveled in the pre-pandemic times and are traveling now from each of the 4 major regions of the US. We survey new travelers each week. After the data is collected, we weight it by using census data, so that is representative of the traveling population of the US. The confidence interval of the top line findings you'll see in my presentation is plus or minus 2.8%. And I've put together an analysis that includes data collected through the last month up until this very past weekend. And my focus with you today is to summarize the breadth of what we know about Americans' thoughts and feelings and behaviors about travel in order to frame some expectations for the next several months. And the simplest way to look at the coming future is, of course, recovery. It's going to be a patient march towards a change, but functioning, even successful travel industry. But for the near term, it's likely to continue to be a roller coaster and also uneven. Some aspects of travel and hospitality regain strength very quickly. I think you saw that this summer where you are. But there are those sectors that are of our industry that are going to continue to need help. So I'll take you through the data right now that looks at this. If there's one thing the industry learned during the crisis is that we do have to pay attention to how people feel, as it ultimately at some point drives their decision making. We'll start with something light, politics. We just had an election. So I wanted to share the president of a top economic firm I follow, ITR Economics. He shared that he's constantly barraged with questions about the impact of the presidential election. And he advised us business people to not get ourselves so amped up about politics when it comes to business. And his reason is that the US economy has had wonderful growth over the past 4 decades, despite of who's in the White House. And the American economy wants to express itself in spite of that. And it's largely the same for travel demand. So Americans were well aware that there was an election on November 3rd for a long time. And still for the 35 weeks I've been conducting this research, trips were planned. They continue to be planned. In line with what the president of ITR Economics says, politics doesn't weigh so heavily, I think, than we might think on people's travel behaviors. What does matter most that we keep seeing is this, and that's the coronavirus. We're in a period of record cases in the US. We're exceeding where we were in July. And it's now spread or more significant across the country. And just showing the virus's more dispersed impact on the US for the first time in 6 months, we're seeing even Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan show up in the top lists of where people are associating coronavirus issues. In the early days of the pandemic, it was always New York, California, Washington. Now it's more diverse and where people think there's coronavirus issues. Pessimism about the course of the virus that it's going to take in the US is now clearly on a renewed growth path, as designated by this orange line here, showing the percent who feel things are going to get worse in the US in the next month. So you see we're returning to levels that we last saw in the summer surge. In addition, 62.6% of American travelers expect the coronavirus will thrive in cold weather. The percent of Americans with high degrees of concerns about personally contracting the virus has moved back to summer levels again after we were in a lower period for almost all of the last 2 months. And they're similarly increasingly concerned about their loved ones contracting it, in fact, even more so than themselves. And this increased anxiety does impact feelings about travel and trip plans in the near term, at least. This surge looks like it's diminished the potential volume of travel that might have occurred in these upcoming few months. When I look at the percent of Americans who have traveled since the onset of the pandemic, it looks like we're still at just over half back to travel. And now we have 60.2% saying that the recent increases in COVID across the country have made them feel less likely to travel in the next 3 months. And unfortunately, 41.8% report that they've actually canceled or postponed a trip they had in these next few months because of the worsening of the pandemic. One of the key indicators we use to measure openness to travel and travel marketability is the ability of discounts and price cuts to motivate trips. This dropped back to a 6-week low after we reached the pandemic period peak just a few weeks ago. So I told you it was a roller coaster. And these renewed concerns have soured excitement for near-term getaways, which had been in an extended pandemic period high. And again, we see openness to travel inspiration also declined after achieving peaks in the pandemic period. But I think most alarmingly for me, as someone that studies travelers, that these feelings seem to extend into greater emotional depth right now. Half of American travelers agree that traveling right now feels irresponsible to them, and over 40% feel or would feel guilty traveling right now. And it's even impacted travelers where you are in the South. When we look at the marketability of Southern travelers, and that's that dark maroon line, it's fortunately ticked back up in this last week, but as you see, it had gone down from where it was over the last month. But it's really important to know that travel took a huge brunt of the fear and perceptions of unsafe activities that exploded in the early months of the pandemic. It's now catching a break, even despite what I just showed you. Like the economy, travel aspirations and demand continue to express themselves. We're just going to have to tolerate the roller coaster and the unevenness. So my first data point showing you this is this. Despite the darkening feelings about the pandemic and the record high number of cases, safety perceptions about travel have not been significantly affected in this period. So the average percent deeming the 24 travel activities that we track in our study as unsafe. It did rise back up for a little bit, but it's nowhere near where it was in July, and absolutely nowhere near where it was at the height of fear about travel in April. And in a sign of travel's recovery, over 60% of American travelers said that a travel advertisement they had seen recently made them happy or very happy. And that's up nearly 10 percentage points from June. And over a third even said they'd be happy to see an ad promoting tourism to the place where they live. Over 35% feel they've become more confident they can navigate this coronavirus situation safely. That confidence has increased for them in the last 3 months. And if you look at the blue line on the right of this chart, the percent of American travelers who need a vaccine in order to travel is on the decline. That's unlike what we saw in July. And again, if you look at the blue line on the right of this chart, the percent who say they're going to engage in some kind of travel avoidance, that's remained stable over the last few weeks. And this is Americans' state of mind about travel, feeling readiness versus hesitation. And as shown by the blue line on this chart on the right, travel readiness state of mind has essentially been heading up since July, and it peaked again this week. So while we may suffer some short-term trips that may have happened that didn't, I think people are still in a readiness state of mind. They may begin planning trips or have trips in mind for 2021 and beyond. Fewer also agree they have lost their interest in or taste for traveling for the time being, and the joy of travel remains ingrained in us. Nearly 60% of Americans agree that having a vacation scheduled in the next 6 months would make them feel there's something happy to look forward to. And again, the point I made earlier, trips continue to be anticipated and planned. 3/4 of American travelers have trips planned in the next year. And when American travelers tell us when their very next road and air trips will be, we continue to see travel expecting to happen, even in the near term, including air travel. And speaking of trips planned, I want to walk you through more in detail at what Americans are reporting about travel for this holiday season. And I think this might tell us something about travel's future. So comparing what they did in 2019 to what is reported for 2020, it looks like the pandemic has deterred some Americans from holiday travel for now. We estimate that 25% fewer Americans will travel to celebrate the holidays this year. To me, that's good news. I feel like when we're looking at this back in April, it could have been a lot worse. When we ask those who are not planning to travel for the holidays their reasons why, the majority have a pandemic-related reason for not doing so, including general fear of the virus and not wanting to risk the health of their loved ones. 41.4% say they have friends and family who would normally travel during the holidays but are not going to now because of the pandemic. And sadly, the pandemic's even messing with our holiday traditions. There's reported decreases in everything from New Year's Eve parties to Black Friday shopping. But let's get back to something happier. Those who will be traveling to celebrate the holidays, 2/3 are reporting that they'll take more than one holiday-related trip. So these holiday travelers are going to take 2.4 holiday-related trips on average. Cars will largely be used, but over a third say that they will fly. And very interestingly, over a third say they plan to test themselves for COVID-19 prior to their trips. And because Thanksgiving's coming up, let's take a look at what travelers are telling us Thanksgiving might look like. So as of 2 weeks ago, 13.6% say they're going to take a trip over 50 miles away from their home for the Thanksgiving holiday, down just slightly from when we last asked in August. The proportion who said affirmative no, they weren't going to travel, that's increased 14 percentage points. And it looks like people who were not sure in August a lot of them moved into an affirmative no right now. For those who said they will travel, nearly 80% say they're making this trip primarily to see their friends and family, no surprise there. But half of them consider this a vacation or weekend getaway. And when we asked them what experiences they would prioritize during their trip, of course, spending time with friends and family, enjoying Thanksgiving traditions, but they really want to prioritize relaxation and escaping stress. And though not as much, over a third of these travelers say they're going to prioritize having new experiences or visiting new places or destinations. And in terms of where they plan to sleep, as you expect, half are going to stay in a private home of a friend or relative, but we have 39% saying they're going to stay in a hotel and 15% staying in a vacation home rental. And they plan to stay 4.3 days away from home. Mean distance traveled 533 miles, but mostly under 500 miles, the greatest proportion. And I wanted to bring this up because although half of them say that they have already decided where they're going to visit, but 44% of them say their intended destination is still flexible. And that represents a potential marketing opportunity for Hilton Head, given the shorter windows that people are planning travel right now. So that's the holidays. Let's get back to things impacting travel and the trends we see shaping up for these next few months. As to how the pandemic has shifted priorities and the way this will potentially impact travel in both the short and longer term. When we look at the lifestyle priorities of those Americans who will be traveling in the near term, and that's your customers coming through the door most in the near future, they first and foremost say they want to find joy and happiness and then just relax. And our research has shown that American travelers have been increasingly saying they're prioritizing their relaxation since the start of the pandemic. And so now more than ever, they're going to be seeking travel and experiences to de-stress, get away from what's ordinary in their life right now, and spend time with family. This all bodes very well for what you have there in Hilton Head. And when we asked in more detail how they will prioritize specific travel experiences in the coming months, topping the list is spending time with loved ones, getting away from crowds, staying close to home, and enjoying nature. These have been top priorities for Americans throughout the pandemic. Dining in restaurants, shopping, and outdoor attractions are what the reported most common trip activities. Unfortunately, though, these numbers are still not at normal levels for what people plan to do on trips. But looking at the factors American travelers say are important to where they're choosing to visit, the good news is we are expressing some normalcy. Like in pre-pandemic times, there's importance placed on affordable, popular, accessible, beach, family friendliness, outdoor recreation. Again, all things you have in the low country in spades. Those are all really important to people when they're looking at why they're going to visit somewhere or where they want to go. But I do want you to note that the pandemic is still going to weigh on destination decisions, likely for some time, both directly and indirectly. They are saying being safe, being a place with good COVID safety procedures, and being a place where people wear masks and socially distance. It's not at the very top of this list, but combined, they're nearly equal to other factors driving destination choice. So it's this whole new set of factors to juggle in positioning and marketing and advertising. We also just asked Americans, as you look out over the next 2 years, in which ways you expect your travel priorities will change compared to before the coronavirus situation. And the most agreement was shared that they'd be traveling more domestically and seeing the United States, as well as traveling more with family. However, on a somewhat different spectrum, and again, this is a good direction we're heading in for the travel industry, nearly a quarter say they'll be visiting more destinations on their bucket list and saying yes to new travel ideas and experiences. The economy, of course, is an uncertainty that could be a wrench thrower in all the good news that we have around travel. While those with elevated levels of personal financial concerns was at a 30-week low just a few weeks ago, it's now ticked back up to July levels. There continues to be strong concern among Americans about our national economy. The good news is when we ask American travelers this question about how they'll prioritize the spending of their disposable income in the next 3 months, food to consume at home is, of course, the highest priority. Travel-related priorities are second. 1 in 4 consider leisure travel to see friends and family a high or essential priority for their spending. In the middle of the chart, 1 in 5 consider leisure road trips at least a high priority in their spending. And between 15 and 17% are prioritizing leisure travel by plane or to attend an event, even international travel. However, the cost of travel is the second most significant impediment to travel in the near term after coronavirus. And even among those who will be traveling, there's a greater cautiousness. I keep saying we're still far from the freewheeling times of 2019. 41.9% plan to be more budget conscious when they travel in the near term. And the economic impact that we see from those who are taking trips, it may be more subdued. Similarly, 43% of those traveling specifically for the holidays say that they're going to spend less on those trips compared to what they did in 2019. But on the horizon that is boding well for travel's recovery is the development and distribution of a vaccine. We keep getting better and better news. Again, the percent of Americans who say they need a COVID vaccine in order to travel has fallen since July. But one area, nearly 47% of Americans have remained steadfast in saying they need to return to their normal pre-COVID lifestyle is a vaccine. And a vaccine looks to be critical in restoring travel to its previous success levels, particularly among this group of Americans, and that's those who are still engaging in travel avoidance. So these are people in our analysis that still say they plan to some degree to avoid travel until they feel the situation is more resolved. And while they need many assurances before they feel comfortable enough to travel again, over half of this group say they need an effective vaccine to be released and widely distributed to feel okay traveling. And if a COVID vaccine was required before traveling, nearly 60% of them say this would make air travel feel safer to them. In addition, 36.7% of American travelers say the availability of an official document confirming COVID-19 inoculation would make them more or much more likely to travel in the coming year. And another one of the important ideas for getting travel and other highly impacted activities back to normal is the institution of testing. So required tests prior to entry. So we looked into the ability of testing to motivate Americans to partake in more activities. And we set this up by asking them their likelihood to do each of these things in the next few months, including fly, watch a movie in a theater, attend a sporting event, spa, theme park. And then we asked them if customers were required to pass a COVID test prior to entry, how likely they would then be to do each of these activities to see if the testing would result in some net positive gains for these activities. So if I bring back the data of those that said they would be likely to do these things against those that say if there was a test, they would be, we see that there are some gains with testing, although they are quite modest. As you saw, tests and vaccines may help the recovery of the airline industry. Air travel is, of course, essential to our tourism economy. We've been tracking its recovery over the last few months. So I want to take you through what we're seeing around air travel. We had some good news recently. The TSA screened 1 million daily passengers for the first time since March a few weeks ago. And looking at the safety perception of travel activities, we see flying on a commercial airline sits here in the middle with 55.3% of American travelers who perceive air travel to be either somewhat or very unsafe. So seen as much safer than taking a cruise, but still far less than road trips. But the perception of commercial air travel is in a far better place now than in the beginning of the pandemic, when over 80% considered air travel unsafe. 1 in 5 Americans we've surveyed have traveled on a commercial airline since the onset of the pandemic. And this chart is again showing you when they anticipate their next trip by air to be. Another sign of measured recovery, over 35% of American travelers plan to travel by air in the next 6 months. And looking at policies that may bring more Americans back to air travel sooner, again, looking at testing specifically, we see that comfort with taking a COVID test prior to a flight is about half, and discomfort is far less than those that would be comfortable with that. And then in terms of the things that are important to them for taking a flight, the mandatory face masks and wanting to social distance. Almost all our major carriers now said that they will not be blocking middle seats any longer. Just wanted to share with you about how travelers are feeling about that. And if they'd be comfortable flying if there was someone in the middle seat. 20.7% of them said they'd be comfortable, but nearly double that proportion said they'd be uncomfortable. And for another 20.7%, they said this is going to be a strict deal breaker, and they're not going to fly if they have the potential of having a stranger next to them. And I think this just is really emblematic of how Americans feel still about having strangers near them, particularly in transportation settings. All right, let me end with the return of business and convention travel, because they are critical to travel's recovery as well. This chart is from Vistage. It's a global executive group of small and mid-sized companies that I'm part of, and this shows that CEO confidence is way up from the beginning of the pandemic. And when we ask employed Americans if business travel has resumed in their companies, 26.7% report it has, up from 24.2% a month prior. And when we ask those that where it hasn't returned when they anticipated to, about half say it will be before the end of Q1. And then on the convention and group meeting side, the percent of American travelers who say they're going to avoid these types of events, it's elevated, but it's still at a pandemic period low. And while 1 in 5 are ready to return to this type of travel this year, the majority of American travelers think they'll be ready in the latter part of 2021. And looking more specifically at those who more regularly travel for conventions and conferences, over half say they would be happy if they were asked to attend such an event in the next 6 months. And there's been a notable growth in that since June. And in more great news for this sector, convention travelers trust in their fellow attendees to behave at these events in a way that protects their health. That's also up significantly since July, as is the trust in the event organizers to institute protocols that protect attendees' health. Nearly 3/4 say they trust the event producers to institute these policies. And since May, we've seen a modest but important increase in the number of American travelers who say they have plans for a convention or conference or other type of group meeting trip. And of those that have plans, many of these trips are actually reported for the near term. And when we ask an open-ended question of having them imagine that their employer asked them to travel to attend a conference in the next 6 months, the one word that describes how they would feel. We have some that say they'll be scared or nervous, but there's many who say they'll feel good or happy they were asked to attend a conference in the next 6 months. I do want to say it's important for the travel industry to be realistic about the threat virtual meetings do pose to the volume and impact of this type of travel in the future. I know we're all missing being together, but I do want people to keep this in mind because it is a threat. 25% of American travelers say they have attended a virtual convention in the pandemic, 3.5 on average. And here's why I worry. When we asked them to compare how satisfied they were with virtually participating in a conference compared to in-person, 71.2% report being satisfied, and dissatisfaction was only expressed by 12%. I was hoping that would be flip-flopped. But fortunately, 60% of American travelers say they strongly prefer in-person to virtual conventions. But 1 in 5 feel neutral. They say they're fine to go either way. And a similar proportion, 19.5%, say they prefer virtual. Interestingly, while millennial and younger travelers are likelier than those in other generations to say they prefer virtual conferences, it's the baby boomers who are the relatively likelier generation to say they strongly prefer meeting virtually, although just 1 in 10 of them are saying that right now. That I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this isn't as much of a threat as it might be, and we'll be back to always wanting to meet in person. So to summarize the key takeaways as we look to travel's recovery and future, this current spike is threatening our near-term recovery. However, Americans' perceptions of travel safety, their confidence in traveling safely, and travel marketability will continue to gradually improve. trips are planned, but the economic impacts of the travel will continue to be muted for some time. Urban destinations are also looking poised for recovery. Business and convention travel resumption will continue at a modest pace. The distribution of an approved vaccine will bring a significant proportion of the travel avoiders back to travel. In addition to affordability and accessibility, factors related to coronavirus safety will continue to be critical to destination selection. And just a couple of things I didn't have time to cover today, but important to note. Travel had threats that existed prior to the pandemic, and their impact will likely accelerate now. These are things like the perceptions of over-tourism. And then really importantly, resources like your Chamber of Commerce and Visitors Bureau are more valued than ever by traveling consumers as a trusted source of information about travel safety. So there's a really important opportunity there. Thank you so much for having me join your meeting this morning. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that you may have. And cheers to our continued recovery.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for that very thorough presentation. We do have a few questions for you this morning, and thank you for agreeing to take those. And the first one is coming from Margaret, and Margaret is asking, do you see a hybrid in-person virtual type of conference happening in 2021?
Yes, so we study meeting planners. We just actually finished our second survey of meeting planners in this pandemic period, and also had a few times had a panel of them, and they're saying hybrid is here through 2021. They're having to plan just because the attendees' comfort level. But they said there's real opportunity there in extending the reach of the events, and hopefully those that attend virtually will come in person for in 2022.
All right, thank you for that. The next one coming from Steve, and Steve is asking, what are you seeing in the trend of workcations and schoolcations?
Yeah, so we took a measure of that back in late August. So it's not a huge, it's not going to save the travel industry, but there is certainly, probably that you've seen, there's certainly a sector of employed Americans or Americans that travel with their kids that are interested in those activities. And because I've had people ask me that. So last week I asked people to describe their perfect destination for those types of trips. And I showed you a lot in this presentation how much Hilton Head is just set up for success through this period. But like things that you have, beach was number one for workcations and schoolcations. So you're in a good position for capturing that modest travel volume that will come from that. But it's a great opportunity.
Thank you. Next question is from Andy, and Andy is asking, would it help for a destination to promote free testing and results in community programs to protect?
So we work with a number of island clients that you actually have to fly to, like Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. So we've asked questions around that through the pandemic to help them with their policies. We'd always seen that it did have a net positive in terms of making people feel a greater desire to want to visit those places. So yes, if there was a testing policy, you would probably get a net gain from that. I do know, having worked closely with those places, though, it's a massive undertaking. And as you know, it took Hawaii this long to reopen.
All right, next question is from Jim, and Jim's asking, do you see the home and villa trend continuing post-COVID?
I do. Whenever we see people experience something, and so I think you've probably seen your data, you brought a lot of new customers to that type of experience during COVID. Whenever you introduce new customers, they're likely to continue. And I imagine that the experience that you gave in them in homes and villas was a wonderful one there in the Low Country. And so I think there's a very strong chance, just what we've always seen with traveling consumer behavior, that they'll be back to that type of experience, whether there's COVID or not.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining us and great information. I did have an ask from one of our participants if requested, or can those slides, your research, be shared?
Yes, absolutely. Bill, I'll send that over to you all to distribute to your members.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great seeing you via Zoom, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Yes, take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye. All right. That was Aaron Francis Cummings speaking, and always delighted to have Aaron and hearing some of her research. Next, we're going to look at it from a state perspective. And our next guest is certainly no stranger to the call. We're glad to have him back on. And it's Dwayne Parrish. Dwayne's been at the helm of South Carolina's tourism industry for over a decade. Dwayne, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill. Glad to be here and glad to be back. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Okay. I thought I would share some, not to overwhelm you with numbers, but a few numbers here in regard to how we're doing, some other things going on around the state, and then kind of end with some thoughts about the winter in 2021. I'll start with the number of hotels closed. We're at 10 hotels closed. All but one are closed due to non-COVID reasons. So really, that's not really having an impact on what hotels closing or opening. The most recent weekly statistics I have for hotel occupancy are from the week ending October 31st, the last week of October. The U.S. ran 44.4% occupancy, which was down 20.4% from the same week in 2019. The Southeast ran 45.6%. And South Carolina ran 45.6%. Leading the area that particular week, leading the state in occupancy that week was the Anderson-Clemson area at 72.7%, was bolstered by the weekend business from the Clemson football game up in the state. Even though there was limited crowds, hotels still did very well. Certainly the rising COVID cases, and you heard Aaron touch on that a little bit, particularly in the Midwest. Ohio and some of those states around the Midwest are feeder markets for us, and that has hurt travel, particularly in these last couple of weeks as we've had record numbers throughout the country in regard to the number of cases. So for the month of September, backtracking just a little bit, in the month of September, I do not have October's final numbers yet, but for the month of September, the U.S. ran 48.3%, Southeast ran 46.2%, and South Carolina ran 49.7%. That is down 16%, only 16% from September of 2019. However, Hurricane Dorian fell into September of 2019. But even within that, we have seen a downward trend, and you saw this in some of Aaron's numbers of intent to travel in regard to closing the gap. And by that, I mean, this is a time of year when occupancy normally starts to fall going into the winter anyway. Therefore, it's important to look at year over year and how things are going there. From that perspective, the month of July was down 29%. August was down 27%. And as I just mentioned, September was down 16%. And then based on the weekly numbers I saw for October, I anticipate it to be down somewhere in the 18 to 19% range. So is a slow trend line down from that regard. Switching to short-term rentals, our data from AirDNA, which tracks the short-term rental market like Airbnb, HomeAway.com, VRBO.com, and those. The U.S. ran 58%, the Southeast 55%, and South Carolina 58%. All of these are above the prior year numbers. As I've mentioned before on previous calls, short-term rentals continue to do well, offering privacy, not non-contact with other people as you would through the hotel, more square footage, the ability to have a kitchen and cook in place if you're not comfortable going out to eat. All those factors have sort of played into that. I think that will likely continue through the winter, but it is short-term rentals have been they were performing pretty well prior to the pandemic, and certainly continued that trend during the pandemic. In an effort to certainly increase our fair share, our more of the market, if you will, in South Carolina, we were able to obtain $20 million in marketing dollars throughout the state. from the governor's COVID-19 Reserve Relief Fund. This is to help us increase our market share. 15 million of that 20 million will go out to our 5 largest partners, one of which is Hilton Head and the Hilton Head Chamber of Commerce, in regard to trying to, whatever the travel market is, and you saw the numbers, how they fluctuate that Aaron presented, but whether it's 50% of people willing to travel or 70%, we look at it as our mission, if you will, to try to get more than our fair share. The pie has shrunk, but we still want to keep the same size piece of pie or even increase it from normal times is what we see, that the ability to do that. The marketing does make a difference. What we show is that South Carolina is open. South Carolina is safe. We do that through some visuals of masks or gloves. We don't show large crowds in the video, whether it's a video or a still shot. So those are some of the messages we send out, that it's safe to come and South Carolina is open for business. State parks continue to perform very well, as I've mentioned before. For this year, they're up anywhere from 20 to 30% over the prior year. That's in camping, cabins, and in day use or admissions, if you will. That has continued through the fall. Bookings for the fall and even for next spring are above last year. However, just because of weather in the wintertime, that will slow down some as the weather gets cooler. But nonetheless, outdoor activities are certainly where a lot of people have wanted to migrate to, being outside, be it fresh air, be it being in less crowds. But that has certainly helped us in the state parks. And I anticipate it to be a banner year we're on a fiscal year from July 1st to June 30th, but I anticipate it to be a record year for state parks this year. As you may be aware already, the governor rescinded the 50% of fire marshal capacity for restaurants in regard to people eating inside. That, as the weather gets cooler, it's more difficult to eat outside. The governor has done that. I will point out that does not mean that every restaurant has to do that. Restaurant operator, depending upon their capacity, may choose to stay at 50%. That may be what his or her customer base prefers. But there's certainly, for those that have the space, that are comfortable doing it, and we'll assume their customer base is comfortable doing it, restaurants do have the ability to increase their capacity to 100% of fire marshal capacity. In regard to the large events or gatherings, as they are called in the executive order, remember from previous, the state set up a website on South Carolina Commerce's website to apply for approvals for events over 250 people or more than 50% of fire marshal capacity. The state has approved over 900 events around the state that have more than 250 taking place. Some of those seem somewhat obvious, like a Clemson football game, as I mentioned earlier, high school football game in sports. Some of those are lumped in together, but those 900 events, there's also been close to 100 events that have been denied or turned down approval for meeting due to a variety of different reasons. And lastly, I'll finish with, and Aaron talked about this a little bit, the forecast of what we think is going to happen through the winter and through the spring and summer of 2021. Obviously, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a slow time of year. I anticipate occupancy to go down during the winter. It will be a tough winter for a lot of hotels and restaurants. It's been difficult at this point. Other factors will play into that, whether or not there's federal financial assistance through another PPP program or economic disaster injury loans would certainly help as we go through that time period of the year. However, I do think we'll continue to close that gap of year-over-year business, and but this is a difficult time anyway, and it's also when many operators of hotels and restaurants use what funds have been profits, if you will, that have been made through the spring, summer, and fall to carry through the winter. That's obviously likely not there for this year, so that does change things from that regard. However, I do believe there's still tremendous pent-up demand. You heard a little bit of it in what Aaron talked about. And I do believe once you see the first videos of someone getting a vaccine on CNN and Fox News, the psychological impact of that will unleash an economic explosion, of which a part of which travel will be. I anticipate people that have not felt safe traveling at some point in 2021, they will feel safe to do so. And because of the cabin fever and they felt pent up, and that pent up demand has built over time, I anticipate a lot of a lot more leisure travel. I anticipate more meetings taking place, conferences. And then at some point, the business travel will come back. You saw Aaron's numbers at 64% of business travel is not ready to come back yet. Some of that's due to the lack of legislation giving them protections, liability protections from business travelers going out, but also the vaccine, I think, will help spur that as well as I think economic activity continues to flourish. Those businesses that want to survive will need to get back in the travel game. So I am optimistic about 2021. Tough time coming ahead in the next couple of months, but I look forward to 2021. And whatever the case may be, I do think business travel will recover, all travel will recover faster than what a lot of people have predicted. With that, Bill, that concludes my report, and I'll leave time for any questions.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. Couple questions for you this morning. First one's coming from Sam, and Sam's asking, are South Carolina cities like Charleston and Greenville starting to see more tourism recovery?
They are seeing some, but downtowns are still out of favor. And, Hilton Head and Myrtle Beach do not have a designated downtown, so to speak. But Charleston and Greenville and Columbia do. The specific downtown areas have not come back in those. Downtown Columbia has done pretty well during USC home football games, as you can imagine, but other weekends, no. It is probably the last section from a geographic standpoint to come back. Larger cities, particularly like in downtown Atlanta, have also suffered more so than rural areas.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Larry, and Larry is asking how the South Carolina golf industry is faring overall.
Golf has been a tremendous bright spot. I recently met with the South Carolina Golf Course Owners Association. Golf, depending on where you are in the state, is up anywhere from as little as 5%, but as much as 25% since the pandemic started. We were fortunate that golf courses never closed in South Carolina. That certainly helped us. But as I mentioned earlier about the outdoor activity, golf has thrived in that time. It has been a silver lining for golf during this time period. Golf very quickly figured out how to sanitize a golf cart. People knew how to keep apart and feel safe. Golf has done very well. I anticipate that to continue. Even our winters are pretty mild. The people that live north of here, I anticipate golf to continue that. It's also introduced some people to the game, some new people. Golf will hopefully hold on to those folks and will help them continue to flourish even post-pandemic.
Dwayne, I'll leave you with what I thought was positive news. Yesterday, I was talking with a pharma executive who was telling me that just recently their 800 sales reps have been given the freedom to travel again in doing their job. And so I thought that was very encouraging news, and also was talking about the looking forward to traveling again for some of their incentive programs.
Yeah, good news to hear.
Dwayne, thanks for being with us today, and we always appreciate you. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to hear from DHEC's Dr. Jane Kelly, and we know there's lots to cover with her. I was privy to see her slides yesterday evening, and Dr. Kelly, thank you for being with us. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you. And thank you once again for inviting me. I always find these very interesting. The two previous presenters are very interesting for me to hear their perspectives. And Kelly has already anticipated. Looks like she's got my slides up. Thank you very much for doing that. Go ahead to the next slide. So first, the numbers. Neither South Carolina nor Beaufort County are in a downward trajectory, but we are in a better position than much of the rest of the United States. So these numbers are already out of date, right? We've got more than 10 million cases nationwide, and more than 6,144 deaths, new deaths. But I also included an extra line here with total healthcare worker cases, because that's going to be pertinent in my discussion of some of our next slides. In Beaufort County, there's been reported a total of 211 people who work in healthcare settings who have contracted COVID-19. In South Carolina as a whole, that's 10,455, and the US as a whole, that's over 200,000. And by healthcare workers, I don't just mean doctors and nurses. We also are including nurses' aides, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, anyone who's involved in healthcare work. For South Carolina as a whole, we've added over 6,000 new cases for a total of 177,515 cases statewide, 111 new deaths for a total of 13 total deaths. And in Beaufort, this is a jump up. New cases in the past week have, weekly have been under 100, but we had 147 new cases in the past week, a total of 6,321, 3 new deaths for a total of 93 deaths. And down in the red box at the bottom, I've got the numbers for Bluffton and Hilton Head. Bluffton added 60 new cases over this past week for 1,938 total, and Hilton Head 32 new cases for a total of 1,174. Next slide. So I wanted to look in a little bit differently at cases by age, and this is over the course of the entire pandemic. So this is going back to the first case in Beaufort County back in March. And I wasn't too surprised to see this age distribution with over 40% of cases in the age range from 11 to 30. College kids, young adults, a lot of this was the peak in July when people were getting together in activities around 4th of July weekend. But go ahead to this next slide. I found this an eye-opener. I looked at it just for the past month, from October 9th to to November 9th. And look at that age range, it shifted. I've got the old slide, the entire time course in smaller print down below, but we've got much more of a wide distribution of age ranges. This is not just high school students, college kids, young adults in bars. We've got a substantial number of people who are 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60. So I don't know what that is. Is it complacency? Is it people not believing that masks make a difference? Is it feeling that, oh, it's just those young kids, that's who all those cases are? It's not me. But I just wanted to point that out because that is concerning. Next slide. So here we've got the trend line, and this doesn't look a lot different than what you already know, but I'm going to show you a couple of other trend lines. The one on the top, that's for the US as a whole, and everyone knows that we're entering a third surge. And the bottom one is South Carolina, which looks like it's plateaued, but no, that's a little bit of an upward trajectory, and that's a concern. Next slide. I want to show you 2 other states. This is Utah. Utah early on did not have a big surge. They didn't have that big July surge. Yes, they had some increase, but not as much as other states. But look at where they are now. Look at the tremendous surge in November. They're having 2,000 to 3,000 new cases a day. And you may have read, there's a new statewide emergency mask mandate. They're importing nurses. They're asking for paying big bucks for travel nurses to come work in Utah. Their healthcare system is starting to become overwhelmed. Next slide. It's even worse in a way in North Dakota. Maybe they don't have as great an absolute number of cases, but from a population point of view, their surge is even more damaging. They're overwhelmed already with 1,200 to 1,400 new cases a day. And one sign of that is that the hospitals have decided that they are going to allow asymptomatic COVID-19 infected healthcare workers to continue to work. They are that shorthanded. Yes, those healthcare workers would be working on the COVID-19 ward, but that's still a really disturbing statistic. Next slide. So why do hospitals become overwhelmed? Remember, it's the number of healthcare workers, not the number of beds. And fortunately in South Carolina, we are in a good position. We have hospital bed occupancy around 78%. As you've heard in the Hilton Head area, the hospital is certainly prepared to take in more patients if there is a surge in South Carolina, but we just want to avoid a surge and just kind of stay where we are or decrease. COVID-19 hospitalizations are usually long. They may be a month or long, and readmission is more common. In this infographic, there was a study looking at people who were readmitted after COVID-19, and 1 in 11 patients who had been hospitalized for COVID-19 were readmitted to the same hospital within 2 months. Next slide. So I've now read you all the warnings, but let me focus also on the good news coming up. So a little bit of background on this new vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine that's in the news. And I just wanted you to understand a little bit about how this vaccine works, because it's a very new technology. We don't have any other vaccines that do this exact approach. Usually with vaccines, you take a virus and you weaken it or attenuate it, or you do something so that it's not viable, it's not able to reproduce, you weaken it, and then you inject it, cells take it up, and then cells start to produce antibodies, and that revs up not only the B cells that make antibodies, but also the T cells, which can kill virus. This has no live or attenuated, weakened, or killed virus. This just has a little piece of the RNA, that's the genetic code, and just not even the genetic code for the whole virus, just the genetic code for that little spike protein, because it's that spike protein that gets the virus into the cell. So you inject that piece of mRNA, that's messenger RNA, and it's taken into the cells, and the cells make just that spike protein and release it, and that you get an immune response. Next slide. Part of the reason that that is such a dramatic approach is there's no way that you can get COVID-19 from the vaccine, and it is anticipated that there'll be rapid scale up, because unlike, for example, the influenza vaccine, you don't have to grow it in egg cells. You don't have to spend an enormous amount of time growing something in cell culture and then weakening it before you can use it. They have the genetic code. They can rapidly scale up manufacturing of this vaccine. However, there are some challenges in allocation and distribution, administration. It's got to be stored at a super cold temperature. That is not a typo, minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 2 injections, 21 days apart. If you are a vaccine provider, say you're a hospital and you're storing it in this ultra cold, and then you thaw a certain number of doses to administer to people, you have to use it within 24 hours when it's thawed. So just to lay it out there that this is going to be complicated. This is very good news, but this is going to be complicated. And you've already heard that the phase 3 interim analysis reported 90% efficacy, which is just great. But I'd warn you that it's preliminary. The final efficacy may be lower, but still, this is very good news. Next slide. So, recurring theme. Do masks really work? Because you got to keep on keeping on until you receive vaccine. And even when you receive vaccine, until we have a large proportion of Americans receiving the vaccine, you're going to need to continue wearing masks. So next slide, do masks really work? Well, you saw my maps of Utah and North Dakota and what's going on in surge. Well, Arizona this summer had that surge. They had 151% increase in cases after that stay-at-home order was lifted. But they really ratcheted down with mask requirements, limited public event, closures of certain businesses, things we don't want to do in South Carolina. We don't want it to get to this point. But it is still helpful news to know that when they implemented those, they had a 75% drop in cases once they put those sustained prevention efforts in across the state. Next slide. So I would still encourage, this is my recurrent theme of encouraging wearing masks. CDC and DHEC recommend for Thanksgiving not traveling, but it's not the travel per se that is the issue. It's what happens when you get to the other end of your travel. Being careful around other people. They may be close family, but if you haven't been living with them, you want to be careful to keep a certain degree of physical distance from them, and to wear a mask when you're indoors with people not eating or drinking, and even when you're outside, to consider wearing a mask if you're going to be standing close to someone, or choose to keep your distance of at least 6 feet. And that's all that I have for today. I'd be glad to take some questions.
All right, Dr. Kelly, thank you. In earlier, some of your slides there that Jamie is asking here is saying many of the states noted are cold weather locations. How much does winter play into additional cases?
It plays a big role. And that's true for biological reasons and social reasons. Social ones, people are more likely to be indoors. And indoors is less safe than outdoors. This is a virus that is spread by droplets, but also by aerosol. So it can hang in the air. If you're outdoors, even a light breeze, it's more likely to be dissipated. So that's the social issue. People are more likely to be indoors during cold weather, but there's a biological reason as well. And this also puts South Carolina in an advantage. Droplet spread is greater if the environment is colder and drier. The dry issue makes a big difference. So the humidity that we sometimes enjoy, quote unquote, in South Carolina is a big advantage for decreasing transmission of the virus.
Well, that certainly gives us something to be thankful for when we have high humidity. Next question is coming from Chuck, and Chuck's asking, Doctor, what percentage of Americans would need to be vaccinated to have herd immunity?
Excellent question, and it depends upon the efficacy. That's like the effectiveness of the vaccine. That's why it was such extraordinary news to see 90%. Let me give you an example. If we had a vaccine that was 75%, I say this because we figured out the numbers earlier, so I know them on the top of my head. If we have a vaccine that was 75% efficacious, we would need 2/3 of America to have received the vaccine to reach what's called herd immunity, meaning not every vaccine is going to work in every person. But if you can get to the point where most of the people around you are immune, then you're protected as well. So 75% efficacy, you would need 2/3 of Americans to get vaccinated. But that includes children too. And these vaccines have not been studied in children yet. They're just starting to do the safety demonstrations in children. So we're still a ways off. If we have a vaccine that's 90% efficacious, that would be extraordinary. We would only need half of America to be vaccinated.
All right, thank you. One last question for you, Dr. Kelly, and you touched on the recent vaccine, and Julie's asking how optimistic are you about the recent announcement?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that this would be effective for, again, some biological reasons. Normally when you have a vaccine that's, attenuated virus, for example, your cell takes it up and then the cell produces a couple of viral particles that make antibodies, but it's a laborious process. Sometimes the virus has to go inside the nucleus of the cell. I mean, it's complicated. This is much more straightforward. The RNA enters the cell machinery immediately starts making the spike protein, so it only has to make a smaller molecule and kick it out. So I'm not surprised to see this highly efficacious. I just want everybody to feel the caution I do about this is going to take a while. This is not the only vaccine that's coming out. There's another mRNA vaccine that's hopefully soon will be submitted to FDA. And that one's doesn't have to be kept as cold. So I'm cautiously optimistic that yes, this is good news, but everybody needs to keep on keeping on a little bit longer because it's going to take a while to get all this vaccine out there.
All right, Dr. Kelly, thank you. And is it safe to assume that as in the past several weeks with your slides, you're give us approval to share those with our listeners and others?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, great, and thank you so much. And I like that. Keep on keeping on. So we'll continue to do that. Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker, we had anticipated having Dr. Rodriguez with us today. And unfortunately, he had a scheduling change late last night and is not able to join us, but we'll have him on very, very soon on a future call. And to wrap us up today, we have Ariana Pernice, and many of you know Ari, and she's the Vice President of the Chamber's Visitor and Convention Bureau, and she's going to share just a little bit with us about our marketing efforts.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. And we had wonderful speakers today that really spoke to the breadth of all the things that we're doing here in the Low Country. And it was really great to hear from not only Aaron, but Dwayne and Dr. Kelly, how well positioned we are here in the Low Country based on all of our natural assets and just the environment that we're in. What we're most proud of and what we continue to tout and shout from the rooftops is all the work that was done very early on when the pandemic and we were in quarantine. And that is all of our efforts with the path forward and setting those protocols and best practices in place across all of our communities here in the Low Country, and how many of our businesses and our members and our community worked so hard to ensure that those were in place when people and our visitors are ready to travel again. So we continue to put those in front of our visitors and the potential visitors that would like to visit the Low Country in this area. And we lead with that message, safety first, and that our protocols are in place. And along with that, we are also aligning with all the things that Aaron and other speakers spoke to today about all of our natural assets, and that we are so well positioned for being outdoor, whether it be on the river, out on the ocean, or on the beaches, or many pathways. It is a great place to explore. You can explore safely. And that has been our message from the get-go when travel was safe to be had again. So we continue to position that, and we will move forward with that messaging and remain nimble and work very closely with our local officials, our community, as well as our businesses to ensure that those messages are being placed to those that are willing and able to travel. And we understand that those change quite rapidly. So that's where that nimble component comes in. And so as we look forward, it's just that proactive approach. We're taking those insights of deep research and putting those in place, and we will continue that momentum into the foreseeable future over across the next 6 to 8 months with our messaging that we are open, that we are safe, and we are ready to welcome those visitors. And so thank you, Bill. I think those are some quick updates, but really, again, just reiterating all those high level insights that everyone shared this morning really do apply to this destination and this area of the Low Country. And we'll continue to push that through and work alongside all of our partners and our members in our community to ensure that Hilton Head Island remains top of mind, along with Bluffton and much of the Low Country as we continue tourism going forward for 21.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for jumping on with us this morning. I do want to double down on what Ari had mentioned, and that is regarding the path forward, and that's exactly what we're doing, is encouraging those that have not yet participated in the path forward plan, readiness plan, to please reach out to us. And you simply need to email pathforward@hiltonheadisland.org, and we will get you information on that. And I would also encourage you to go to our website, thepathforward.org. As we get ready for the holidays, it's certainly important that we all continue to act responsibly. And through this Path Forward initiative, we're encouraging not only businesses, but our residents and guests to do that exact same thing. So again, we're very, very appreciative for you being with us today. Certainly appreciative of all of our veterans. And as we close out today, be kind, stay safe, and wear your mask. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.